Hi, everyone, and welcome back to True Crime Wife by Jess. I'm your host, Jess Milliken. On this podcast, we focus on female offenders and what caused them to offend. While many of the cases that we'll talk about involve violent crimes, we'll also cover less violent crimes committed by women because understanding why is just as important as understanding what. And because we don't want to talk about just the gruesome cases that are already solved, I also want to bring awareness to the unsolved homicides and missing person cases, the ones that haunt us at night. So we also have episodes that are dedicated to those cases in the hopes that someday they'll be solved and families affected can have answers and justice can be served. If you are a family member or someone impacted by a case like that, please reach out to me at truecrimewifebyjess@gmail.com. I'd love to discuss the case and help bring awareness to it, and maybe it will help. Normally, today's episode would have been an unsolved case, but I'm actually still working with a family to get more information so that I can really do that case justice. So this week, we're discussing a case out of Cleveland, Ohio. It's pretty recent, and it's a case of a female offender who snapped, and we'll talk about it. But before we dive in, please remember that this is a new podcast and it's still growing. Please share it out, give it 5 stars on whatever app you're listening to. That really helps the show grow. Also, please check out my Facebook page, The True Crime Wife by Jess. That's where I post updates about the podcast as well as additional content for each episode as they are released. Today's episode is the one with the manipulative girlfriend. I stumbled across it on the Book of Faces, or Facebook, go figure, and I was instantly intrigued and had to take a closer look. So this family lost a son. He wasn't just a son, he was a nephew, he was a grandson, a sibling, and all because of a girlfriend who was manipulative, remorseless, and she did some pretty insane things after committing her crimes. So we're going to talk about it. This is a case of Dy'mond Vaden, who murdered her boyfriend, George Cox Jr. So let's talk about George. George Anthony Cox Jr., known as June or Junebug by his family, was born October 6, 1992, in Cleveland, Ohio, to George Cox Sr. and Sonia Calloway. He came from a big, close-knit family, the kind where everyone knows everyone, they stay connected, they show up for each other. And George had a personality that people don't forget. He was funny, outgoing, a little mischievous. He was always joking, always making people laugh. He was the kind of person who could walk into a room and instantly lift the energy. His family and friends say that he never met a stranger. He was the life of the party. But beyond that, he was a father, and that was the role that meant the most to him. His daughter, Gianna, was his entire world. Physically, George was on the shorter side. Just saying, for a guy. I'm 5'4" ish, and he was 5'6" and around 185 pounds. The judge asked about his size in court, so that's how we know this. At the time of his death, he had just turned 32 years old, so he was still young and had his whole life ahead of him, and it was stolen. Now, from what I gathered from watching the sentencing hearing, he spoke to his mom on the phone or communicated with her in some way almost every single day. So it was definitely odd for him to just stop communicating. So let's talk about Dy'mond. And that's Dy'mond, Dymond. That's her name. So around 2020, George met Dy'mond Vaden, and they started what would be an on again, off again, very tumultuous relationship, to say the least. Despite the on again, off again status, though, he introduced Dy'mond to his family. She even called his dad. Although, and this was annoying, so in court, she claimed that she only did that because George wanted her to and because it was respectful. So there were a few times during court that Dy'mond also made comments that made me think that maybe she was trying to allude to some domestic violence in the relationship that she had with George, but it never fully came out as that. It was just alluded to. And I couldn't find any history of this I looked at the court records in Cleveland because they're public and like the different dockets and stuff, and neither Dy'mond or George have any violent criminal history, at least not in Cleveland. I was hoping to find more information about whether that was a thing or not, but unfortunately kind of came up empty-handed. So if anybody else happens to find that information and wants to share that with me, I would be grateful because I am kind of curious what their relationship looked like for the on again, off again thing, if it was because there was some sort of violence in the relationship or if it was just that they didn't get along well with each other. But Dy'mond even met his daughter, though, at one point. So according to her, it was only once or twice, which she made it sound like it wasn't a frequent thing, like she wasn't a big part of his daughter's life or even like involved with his family that much. So I don't know the dynamics of his relationship with his daughter, but I know from reading the obituary for him and from listening to the victim statements during the hearing that his daughter meant the world to him. So whatever that custody arrangement looked like, I am pretty sure he was spending as much time as possible with his daughter. So for them to have been in a relationship for on again, off again for 4 years and him only having had her be around his daughter a couple times doesn't make sense to me. But that's what she said anyway. Either way, this wasn't a casual relationship. Even though they were on again, off again, he had welcomed her into his world. She had met his family. She'd met his daughter. She spent time with him. She spent time with the family. She called his dad. So I don't know much about Dy'mond's family life. What we do know is that Dy'mond was born in August of 1992, and she was raised by her family to be honest, truthful. Her family is described as being a good family, a family that raised her with values. So this isn't a case where like she grew up in a bad environment or had a bad family life and then did something horrible. From all accounts, she had a good childhood. She grew up in a good household. So then what happened? Well, on October 19th, 2024, Dy'mond was at George's home in Cleveland, Ohio, and they had some sort of disagreement or an argument. Now, while the details of that argument or the exact details surrounding the lead up to his death aren't completely clear, and they weren't discussed in detail during the sentencing hearing, like I said, we do know that at some point, Dy'mond stabs George. George begins stumbling around the home. He's bleeding out. He's obviously in shock, but what happens next is truly insane because not only was he stabbed, but he was beaten by her. So I don't know if he was beaten before she stabbed him or if it was after. I'm not sure which happened first, but George was beat up. That is a fact, in addition to being stabbed. According to Dy'mond, she wanted to help him. You know, she stabbed him, but she claimed she didn't want him to die. She wanted to help him, but he wouldn't stay still so that she could. He's stumbling around the house. You know, he's in shock. He's bleeding out. He was moving around the apartment. Personally, and this is me personally, I think he was probably trying to get away from her because he knew she wasn't going to help him. Maybe he was looking for his phone because we'll talk about that. But according to Dy'mond, she said he just kept saying to help him. But guess what? If you didn't guess it already, she didn't help him. She never called 911. She never called anyone to come help. As he bled out in that apartment, dying in front of her, she Googled, how long does it take for someone to bleed out after being stabbed in the abdomen? Yes, you heard that correctly. She Googled that. How long does it take for someone to bleed out after being stabbed in the abdomen? Like, she wanted to know how long she should wait for him to bleed out before she left, which it always boggles my brain when criminals do stupid things like this. But at the same time, this was key in proving that she could have helped him, but she chose not to because he was alive when she Googled that. And the fact that she Googled that proves that he was alive. She had time and opportunity to help him and chose not to. Now, what's even more troubling is that George had a cell phone. You know, it's 2024 when this happened. Everyone has a cell phone. But for some reason, he couldn't get to it. Now, Dy'mond claims he was in shock, so he couldn't find his phone. But honestly, I think she took the phone and just wouldn't give it to him. The fact that there was blood all over the apartment makes me think he might not have even been stumbling around out of shock, but maybe he was trying to get his phone from her to get some help. Like, you're not going to help me. Give me my phone and I'll call and help myself. Dy'mond claimed during sentencing that he didn't want to leave the apartment either. The judge specifically asked her, so what did he want to leave the apartment? Did he want to leave to go someplace? And she said no. Her answers were so vague. I will go over that more. But I find that hard to believe that he just got stabbed, he's bleeding out, and he's like, I want to stay here. That's even in shock. You're not gonna be like, yeah, let's just stay in the apartment and hang out. No. So George suffered. He suffered unnecessarily that day while Dy'mond just watched. She watched him bleed out all over the apartment. And when I say that, I keep saying like he bled out all over the apartment. I mean it, because when investigators would eventually check out the apartment, they used luminol because somebody had attempted to clean up all the blood, and that place lit up like a Christmas tree. There was blood everywhere. And at one point, and this was crazy, so I know I'm jumping ahead talking about the sentencing hearing, but this is where we get the most information about what happened. Judge Richard Bell is giving her the third degree. And she says, he's questioning her heavily. And she says, quote, I've never been in this type of situation before, Your Honor, end quote. Well, no shit, Sherlock. None of us have been before. When something like that happens, nobody's like, oh, I've been in this situation before. I can totally fix this. No, that's not a thing. But that doesn't mean that you get to not help someone after you stab them. That's not how that works. So once George had succumbed to his wounds, Dy'mond called up a couple of buddies. Although I'm not sure if they were her buddies or her friends or just acquaintances. Their relationship doesn't seem very clear. They seem like they would be friends if she's calling them to cover up a murder. Because honestly, if I murder somebody, I'm calling my best friend and be like, hey, yo, Cassie, come on out from Minnesota, please. I'm going to need some help. I'm not calling two random people that I'm not good friends with or that I don't think can help cover up a murder, right? So, but that's what she supposedly did. Like, she was really weird about this during the hearing. So during the sentencing hearing, the judge specifically asks her, who did you call? And initially she says, quote, some people I knew in the community, end quote. I mean, that must be a tight-knit freaking community if you're calling them to come help hide a body. And the judge wasn't buying that either. He was like, giving her that look, the dad look, like, I need more than that. So she adds on their names, William Rogers and Donald Humphrey. She says that she called them and said, hey, I need help. They came over, and then supposedly she left the home and they wrapped George's body in a bedsheet and bound it with marine-style rope, and then they disposed of him. Now, according to Dy'mond, she didn't know where they took him. She wasn't there when they wrapped up the body. She wasn't there when they attempted to clean up the scene. She called them, they got there, she left, and she never went back, according to her. We're going to talk about why I don't think that that's the case. So anyway, we're going to continue here. So she claimed that during all of this stuff is going on, that she panicked. And that's why she didn't call 911. That is the reason that she gives for why she didn't call after she stabbed her boyfriend to be like, he needs help. I'll suffer with the consequences, hold myself accountable for stabbing him. If they were in a fight, if they were in an argument or something, why not just call the police, have somebody come to help and explain this is what happened? It doesn't make any sense. She says she panicked, so she didn't call 911. It doesn't explain the cover-up after. That doesn't seem like panic. It seems very calculated to me, and just very messed up. So George has been murdered, and he was always communicating with family. So when his family hadn't heard from him, they couldn't get a hold of him, they couldn't find him, a missing persons report was issued on November 8th, 2024. So this was about 3 weeks after his death. The Cleveland Division of Police, which is the CDP, the Missing Persons Unit, was assigned to the case. The officers went to the residence near Bosworth Road and Peony Avenue in Cleveland, and they found a vacant apartment with little to no furniture and what appeared to be blood on the floor. So Whether it was Dy'mond or her two friends there that failed to clean up the blood, they didn't do a good job of cleaning up the scene because there was blood, and Dy'mond was also no longer at the residence. Now, a lot of the reports and articles out there say that Dy'mond and George were living together at the time of his murder. But during the sentencing hearing, Dy'mond denies that and says that she stayed there sometimes, but that she had someplace else that was her residence. So I'm going to go with what the investigators report, which is that they were living together at the time and she moved out after the murder, which is suspicious. Now, obviously, George's family were devastated because their son is missing. No one knows what happened to him. There's been blood found in the apartment. And after he came up missing, they actually asked Dy'mond, like George Sr. and an aunt of George's asked Dy'mond if she knew what happened to George. And Dy'mond lied and said no. She didn't know. So for the next 7 months, the family would worry, stress, and search for George. George's father, George Sr., actually lives in Michigan, and he traveled to Ohio 26 times over the course of 7 months to try to get answers, to follow up with the family, and to do whatever he could to find his son. The last time that George's father had spoken to George Jr. Was on October 17th. He had talked to his dad about something to get advice and ask some questions, but then he had to go, and his dad was like, well, just call me later. But he never heard from him again. So during sentencing, George Sr. said, quote, "It's been a nightmare." And I just mentioned that I think most of us who have never gone through something like this can't even imagine just how much of a nightmare this was for the family. I mean, for 7 months, you guys, 7 months, they searched, they hoped, they waited. And all this time, Dy'mond knew what had happened, and her two accomplices, Donald and William, also knew what had happened. And no one said anything. On May 15th, 2025, two individuals were minding their own business, as is often the case, and they were out kayaking on the Huron River in Erie County right around 10 a.m., which, as an avid kayaker, I love to kayak. That's a great time to be out kayaking. Maybe not for them this day. They were in a marshy area about 1,000 feet south of the State Route 2 bridge in Huron Township when they stumbled upon something. And I don't know who these people are, but I'm sure that, like any person, when they stumble across something like this, I'm sure that they thought at first, okay, that's not what we're seeing. That's not what we think it is. But if they did have those thoughts, they were poorly mistaken because they had discovered a body that had been bound with rope and wrapped in a bedsheet. And they immediately contacted law enforcement, and the Erie County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene. Now, they wouldn't identify that body as George Cox Jr. until July 2nd, or at least that's when they publicly announced that they had identified the body as George Cox Jr., July 2nd, 2025. And at that point, the Sheriff's Office contacted CDP since it was their case, and they would continue to investigate. But now it wasn't a missing persons case, it was a homicide. Let's talk about some of the shady things that Dy'mond did while investigators were trying to figure out who killed George, shall we? Because there's a lot. On the day that George's body was discovered, so back in May of 2025, it was the day his body was discovered, before they had even confirmed who it was, she sent an interesting text message to her new boyfriend. And I'm not 100% sure when she started seeing this new guy, just to put that out there. It could have been before her and George ended their relationship. And by ended their relationship, I don't mean willingly, because she ended the relationship for them. But we know that she had started seeing this new guy, Emmanuel McQueen Jr., and that's who she was living with when George's body was found. Now, apparently, and no surprise here, she'd been arguing with Emmanuel, or they were having some sort of a fight, and he wasn't responding to her messages. So, the same day that the body is found, she sends a text message to her new boyfriend saying, quote, "You are going to be missing next." Yeah, you are going to be missing next. Now, prosecutors were not able to confirm if it was public knowledge that a body had been found at that point. So they don't know that if she actually knew that the body had been found. It might just be a huge coincidence that on the same day that they find a body, she sends that text message to her current boyfriend who she's having an argument with. Yeah. So it could just be a coincidence, but I think she knew. And even if she didn't know, why would you send a message like that to your current boyfriend when your previous boyfriend is missing? That is some shady crap and makes you look super suspicious. I'm just saying. She had an interesting explanation for this though during sentencing, because this text message was a bit of a sore spot for the defense, and it was referenced a couple of times by the prosecution during sentencing. According to Dy'mond, all she meant by that message was that, my boyfriend knows what I'd gone through and he wasn't answering me, so I was worried. So it was just a message to be like, are you okay? It wasn't supposed to be a threat. But that's not how you jokingly ask someone, like, hey, are you missing now too? That would have made more sense and been maybe more acceptable than just a blatant, you're going to be missing next. That sounds threatening. I don't care how you say it. You are going to be missing next. You are going to be missing next. You're going to be missing next. It doesn't matter. It does not sound positive at all. It's a threat. And it makes her look even more suspicious. Now, the judge asked her a couple of different times about that message and even pointed out that, hey, the message says this, and what you're telling me doesn't really make sense. So at that point, she's just kind of stumbles and she's like, it was just a message. Yeah. Just a message. Okay, Dy'mond. So we have this message, but that wasn't all the evidence that the investigators had to arrest her. Not even by a long shot. They went to Dy'mond's after George's body was identified, and they discovered some things, including boots at her home that she was sharing with her new boyfriend, Emmanuel. So they're living together, and so the police go there and they find these boots, and these boots appear to have blood on them. And investigators also found clothes that had blood on them, and guess whose blood it was? If you said George, you're correct. She kept the clothes and the boots from when he was murdered. Honestly, we could probably just do a segment on idiots in the news or idiot criminals or something. So on top of that, so they end up searching their apartment, and Emmanuel was apparently not supposed to have any weapons. So when the investigators searched their home, they found weapons, which resulted in Emmanuel being arrested along with Dy'mond. Although I do want to point out, there is no evidence that suggests that Emmanuel was part of the murder or cover up of George's death. At least if there is any evidence, that's never been shared publicly. And like I've checked the docket for Emmanuel, and he's only being charged with the one possession of weapons charge, and that's it. So he just happened to be breaking the law while also living with a murderer, but not actually involved in that murder. So now, they also discovered that the sheet that was used to wrap up George's body was from the residence where George and Dy'mond had both resided. We've got that shady text message to her current boyfriend the same day George's body is discovered. We have clothing and boots with his blood on them that are at her new residence. They also checked her phone, which is where they discovered the Google search, how long does it take someone to die from being stabbed in the abdomen? I mean, just wow. Lots of evidence. It all stacked up. So on July 21st, 2025, Dy'mond was arrested. And on July 25th, 2025, she was indicted and charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of felonious assault, 1 count of tampering with evidence, and 1 count of gross abuse of a corpse. And 1 count of having weapons under disability. And Emmanuel was also arrested on July 21st. And his only charge, like I said before, is the 1 count of having weapons under disability. So not involved in the murder stuff that we know of. So let's talk about the court stuff. There would be multiple pretrial court dates set, and most of those were continued at the request of the defense or the prosecution. And from what I saw from reading through the court docket, there were discussions about negotiating a plea deal, which is partially why court was continued. They did go to court on August 25th, 2025, and at that time, the defense attorney, Deanna Robertson, had filed for a psych eval for Dy'mond. So she was referred to the court psychiatric clinic. I have no clue what the results of that psych eval were. It is not in the court documents that I was able to find online. It's not referenced anywhere. We know that she was competent to stand trial. So there's that. The pretrial hearing was continued with the final pretrial court date being December 22nd, 2025, at least at that point. So she's got to do a psych eval and stuff. And they're like, oh, tentatively, we're going to do a final pretrial December 22nd, 2025. By September 30th, 2025, we see the court docket showing more continuances and the first mention of plea negotiation. So they're trying to make a deal with her. This continues until February 23rd of this year in 2026. Dy'mond is in court on that day, and this is where we find out what the plea deal is that she has agreed to and what the amendments are to the charges. Dy'mond pleads guilty to involuntary manslaughter and felonious assault. She also pleads guilty to offenses against a human corpse. And so ultimately, the plea negotiation, the plea deal that she takes is that she'll plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter, felonious assault, and abuse of a corpse. So on March 11th, 2026, court resumed for the sentencing portion of the trial. So the court accepted her guilty plea, as well as the change in the charges against Dy'mond. So the sentencing hearing, this was an opportunity for victim statements to hear from the prosecution and defense, including Dy'mond, and for the judge to make a determination on exactly how much time Dy'mond would be serving for her crime. Now, the full sentencing hearing is about an hour and a half. You can actually watch it on Court TV. I watched it on YouTube, and it is very interesting. And it's start to finish. Everything's right there. There was a lot that came out during this hearing. I'm going to start with the defense attorney, Deanna Robertson, because she said some interesting things. And I want to touch on that before we start talking about victim statements. So the first thing that stood out to me was when Dy'mond's attorney speaks on her behalf. First of all, I know a lot of people don't like attorneys, and that's okay, especially defense attorneys. They've got a tough job. They have to defend people that are guilty. They have to defend people who are innocent that might still be found guilty. They've got a tough job. So I know that Attorney Robertson is doing her job. I know that. You know that. We all know that. So she has to say whatever she can to try to relieve some of the culpability from her client to try to get the court to give Dy'mond the least sentence possible, because that's her job. Realistically, like I said, I know that. It makes sense. But, and I say but, because it's still crazy sometimes what the attorneys say to make that happen. And we're gonna see why. Attorney Robertson said during sentencing that she wanted people to remember that everyone can say, I would do this or I would do that in this same situation. But unless you're in the situation, you don't actually know what you do. How you react depends on how you handle difficult things. So she went on to say that this was a horrible situation and that her client has accepted responsibility in the situation and that she's also a human being. She's not a monster. Attorney Robertson discusses Detective Kevin Callahan's remarks during the sentencing, which we'll go into more detail later, but she makes it clear that she doesn't think that he can accurately paint a picture of who Dy'mond is because all of his interactions with her were surrounding this situation, and he didn't know her with her family or how she reacts under stress. So she essentially said that he can say what he perceived under the situation, but when he was questioning her during the investigation, she was fighting for her life. So the interactions were not going to be good per se. So, I mean, I have to say, Attorney Robertson did the best that she could with this situation. She isn't wrong when it comes to people looking at a situation and saying, well, I would do this or I would do that. But also, I think most people, and I feel this with every degree of certainty, I feel like most people can say that if they stab someone and it's because they're afraid for their life or something like that, that they're still going to call someone to help. I feel pretty confident about that, but maybe I'm wrong. Like, I'd like to think that most people are good, which I know is weird because I do this true crime thing and I watch and listen to true crime stories all the time. But I like to think that most people at their core are good people. But that's probably me being overly hopeful and naive or whatever. But Either way, Attorney Robertson made her statement. Now, there is one thing that Attorney Robertson said that stood out, and I'm going to mention it because it's not something we see enough of these days. She mentioned that Dy'mond's family is not an enabling family. They don't condone any decision that she's made in this situation. Now, her family was in court with her. They were in the court. They were watching, but none of them spoke on her behalf. Usually, the defense will call character witnesses to talk about the good things about the person who's being sentenced in an effort to, get a lighter sentence imposed by the courts. But Dy'mond didn't have that. And her family showed up in court to be there for her, but none of them spoke for her. And I think more families need to be like that and maybe take a note out of that book. Because it annoys the crap out of me when someone makes a bad decision and their family comes to their rescue or tries to cover it up or make it sound like it wasn't their fault. If they did it, they did it. Don't enable. We'd probably have less criminals in this world if people didn't enable each other. So shout out to Dy'mond's family for not being enablers. So another piece of this hearing is an opportunity for the defendant, aka Dy'mond in this case, to make a statement. Generally, this is where an apology to the family takes place. And let's just say she made an attempt. Was it an honest attempt? I don't know. I will say that as I watched the sentencing hearing, her face never changed the entire time. She never showed any emotion. She was very stoic. When she spoke, it didn't seem genuine at any point. And that's just my perspective from watching it. So if you're interested in that, like I said, you can watch it on YouTube. And I'd love to hear y'all's opinions if you do watch that. Like, her reactions just, there aren't any. It's weird. So anyway, during her sorry speech, Dy'mond said, quote, "I am sorry that I wasn't able to help, that I wasn't able to call the police," end quote. Woman, you were 100% able to do those things. You chose not to. Those were your decisions. Regardless of the situation or how stressed you were, you made the decision not to help him. Absolutely ridiculous. It's also during this apology, or whatever you want to call it, that she said she isn't the type of person to hurt someone on purpose without a reason. So this is, again, where I think she's trying to suggest that there was something domestic violence in nature happening, potentially. But again, there isn't anything else brought up about this during the sentencing hearing. There's nothing on the criminal dockets. There's no charges. There's nothing in either of their history as far as criminal charges go that shows any history of that. So I don't know if she's just saying that to try to make herself seem less guilty, even though she's pled guilty. I don't know. So now, obviously, we didn't have a full trial for this case because she took a plea deal. So the judge has some questions to ask Dy'mond. One thing to know is that apparently the defense didn't ask for a pre-sentence investigatory document, or they didn't provide one to the court. So that's a document that would normally include information about the defendant's background, the circumstances of the crime, and the crime itself. And the purpose of that document is to provide additional information so that the judge can make an accurate determination on the appropriate sentence for the offender. So one of the questions that the judge asks, just to go back really quick, that's important to know because the fact that there isn't one of these means that the judge now has to ask questions to get more information. And it comes up a couple times during the trial that, hey, this document doesn't exist and you didn't ask for it. So one of the questions that the judge asks Dy'mond is specifically about her family. Attorney Robertson mentions that her family isn't an enabling family. So he asked Dy'mond, "Your family taught you not to lie." And she responded, on some level. On some level, what does that even mean? They either did or they didn't. Her answers are so vague and weird. It's like she's still trying to manipulate everyone into thinking that she's the victim somehow, or she didn't actually do this, but she's pleading guilty anyway. I don't know. Now, Judge Richard Bell, he's the preceding judge, he asks Dy'mond some specific questions about the crime itself. He asked her what happened to George, which I think I mentioned earlier. And she starts by trying not to say anything at all. And she's like, "Oh, my attorney said not to talk about myself," which that's not what the judge is asking her to do. So he asks again. And she says he was stabbed and beat up. And then he says, who did that? And she says, me. He asks a lot of questions about what happened, which I've already mentioned the details of earlier. That's how we know what happened in the apartment, because the judge asks these questions during the sentencing hearing, and Dy'mond gives him those answers. Now, Dy'mond asserts that she had nothing to do with the removal of George's body from the apartment or the disposal of his body in the river. She claims she called William and what was the other guy's name? Donald. William and Donald, who came and did all of that, and then she left. She didn't stick around to see what happened. She didn't help clean up. She didn't do anything else. She left and never went back to the apartment. That's her story. However, I don't think I believe her, especially when the judge asks her some questions during the trial. The judge asked her who she called, and she said, some people in the community, which again, I know I already mentioned it, but that's not a thing. No one is calling up random people to help them dispose of a body. You call your bestie, someone you're close to that you know won't say anything. Or you call someone who knows how to get rid of a body, you know, if you happen to have some shady friends or know some shady people. I think these were just shady people that she might have known. Maybe they weren't friends, but she knew that they were shady enough to be able to do this. Anyway, she called up these two, and she claims she just told them she needed help to get rid of him, but she couldn't stay. She didn't want to stay, so that's what they did. They got there, she left, and they got rid of the body for her. End of story. Supposedly, these two individuals also threatened her and told her if she told anyone what they did, that they'd hurt her and her family, which that also seems weird. Like, I almost think maybe there were gang ties potentially here. Like, why are they threatening her when she's the one that killed the guy? Like, it just doesn't track. And I noticed something when Dy'mond was telling the judge about these two guys, that her attorney gave her a weird look, and I don't know what that look meant, but it was weird. It was almost like she either didn't believe what Dy'mond was saying about the threatening part, because actually it was when Dy'mond was talking about being threatened by them, the attorney kind of looked at her funny, gave her this look. So I don't know what that look meant. I don't know if maybe she didn't want her to talk about it, or if maybe she's like, where did this come from? Because I've never heard this before. I'm not sure, but there was definitely a shared look between them. So if you happen to go through and watch it, tell me what you think when you get to that part, because there's definitely a look, and I would love to know what that look was for. Now, again, Dy'mond has claimed she left the apartment, and she also asserts that she never went back. She left, and that was the last time she was at the apartment. She didn't stay when the two guys got there, so she doesn't know what they did to the body. But the judge asked if the sheet that they used came from the apartment or where it came from. Did it come off the bed? And Dy'mond says, oh, they used a sheet that was on the floor in the bedroom. Okay. The judge also asked her where the rope came from. And at that point, she's like, well, I don't know. I left. I wasn't there. And the judge isn't stupid. Judge Bell's not a stupid guy. He asked her how she knew about the sheet then. And she said that she just didn't know. She had a message. She panicked and left. So her statements aren't making sense. She's like, oh, I actually don't know. And she starts to kind of fumble here. And there are very clear inconsistencies in her story about what happened, about whether she was there when the body was removed or if she wasn't. Not consistent whatsoever. Now, at one point, when Judge Bell is asking Dy'mond questions, Attorney Robertson speaks up and says, oh, we already provided that information. And this is why Judge Bell is awesome, because he kind of lays into her at this point. He points out that, well, there wasn't a pre-sentencing investigation document provided, and she was told, as in Attorney Robertson was told, that if one wasn't provided, that he, as the judge, would need to ask questions at sentencing. And he said, quote, these are logical questions that the court should be apprised of. And then he said, if you want, we can continue this and you can get that done. Or if you have the information in documentary form, you can provide it to the state. And then she said, I already provided it to the state. And he said, which this is honestly my favorite part. He had the best look on his face ever. He looks at her and he's like, quote, with me. You can share it with me, end quote. And then the hearing continued at that point, and I had to pause it at that point to kind of make note of that because it was just great. Go Judge Bell. That part amused me. I enjoyed it quite a bit. Now, let's talk about the most important part of this entire case, and of the sentencing hearing, and that's the victim's impact statements. We hear from 5 people during this hearing, 4 family members of George and the detective who handled his case. The first person to speak is Sonia Calloway, George's mom. And she doesn't speak for very long. She keeps it short, but you can hear the grief in her voice. And it was basically, she thanked the court, the detective, the investigators, the judge, the DA's office for their time, for the efforts put towards the case. I don't think that she was honestly, I don't think she was able to say anything else. And as a mom, I could feel and sense her grief, and she didn't need to say anything. She said it all just by standing up there for that short period of time. Now, after she spoke, George's aunt, Annette Marie Ford, spoke, and she had a lot to say. She started by thanking Jesus, thanking the detective and all of the officers who worked diligently to find her nephew. She said he was her first nephew, and she doesn't have children of her own, so he was like a child to her. She said the last time that she saw him was on her birthday, which was July 24th of 2024, so a couple months before he was murdered. This was it was almost 3 months before he would be murdered. That was the last time that she saw him. And she said during her statement, quote, "There is no amount of time that this person could get to bring back my nephew. That person will have family to come and see her, but I'll never see my nephew. He has a daughter who will never remember her father. How could someone do something so terrible? It could have been avoided." End quote. This was powerful to listen to. And one of the things that I noticed about Annette and about George's family in general is that when they talk about Dy'mond, they refer to her as that person. She's not even a human being to them at this point, and I honestly get it. Annette also stated, quote, "I'm angry, Your Honor. I'm very, very upset. This has tore our family up so bad, so bad. And it's so heartbreaking. It's hard for me to be respectful." End quote. Honestly, his entire family, they were very respectful during their statements. I've seen a lot of cases where that's not the case. And I don't blame people for being expressive. And you know what? If that person killed your loved one, be disrespectful. But I think this says a lot about the type of people that they are. They're good people, and they didn't want to stoop to the same level as Dy'mond. So that was just something that I noticed when I was listening to their statements. Now, another aunt of George's speaks, Chaplain Candace Amos. She said, quote, "We will never recover from our loss. He was not garbage. He was a son, a grandson, a brother, an uncle, a friend, and certainly not last, a father." End quote. And then George's father, George Cox Jr., he also spoke. They were close. George was very close with his father. They spoke often, despite living states apart. George Sr. also, like I said earlier, he visited 26 times from Ohio to Michigan during the 7 months that George Jr. was missing. That's what we call a dedicated, committing, loving parent who wants to find their kid. George Sr. also spoke about how he and George Jr. shared locations all the time, so they always knew where each other was. And so he knew his last known location, the street where he lived, where that terrible murder happened. And he talked about this. Now, the last person to speak on behalf of George Jr. was Detective Kevin Callahan. He's been a police officer for 30 plus years, 15 years plus of which have been working on missing persons cases. He said in his statement that he's had similar cases to the one that they were there for that day, but this was the first time that he felt compelled to make a statement. So I'll say that again. This was the first time in 30 years, 15 years of working on missing person cases that he felt compelled to make a statement during sentencing. He said, quote, "I've been working on this case since November 2024 when the missing person report was initially made. I've had the opportunity to get to know his family. The thought of not knowing where your family member is a heavy burden to bear." End quote. He also mentioned later in his speech, quote, "Your Honor, don't be fooled. What you're looking at is a sheep in wolf's clothing. She can lie and manipulate like no one I've ever encountered. She can lie and be very believable. It's a terrible talent that she possesses. She has no moral compass." End quote. Wow. Detective Callahan. Wow. Yeah. Wow. So he also spoke about Dy'mond's parents, who he described as ethical, kind people. And he said that knowing her family and her parents and the type of people that they are, he doesn't understand why she is the way that she is. He said, quote, "What I can say is there are bad people out there that have kids that grow up in bad environments, but the kids are wonderful and grow up to be wonderful people. Dy'mond has a good family, and yet here we are. She knowingly, willingly disposed of a human being. Dy'mond is all about Dy'mond." End quote. Those were powerful words from Detective Callahan, and I think they're even more powerful because, again, of all of his cases, he very rarely gets up and talks at the sentencing hearing. But this one impacted him a lot. He has some pretty strong feelings about Dy'mond as well. And, he felt he needed to speak on behalf of George Jr. and on behalf of his family who want justice, because they want justice to the fullest extent of the law. So after all of this, the testimony, the plea deal, Dy'mond was officially sentenced to a minimum of 19.7 years in prison and a maximum of 25.2 years. Personally, I don't think it's enough time, but it's something. And I hope the family is able to find at least some peace knowing that she's behind bars, at least for the time being. But again, no amount of time is going to make up for the fact that they've lost George Jr. Now, what about the other two guys, the guys that took care of the body? I did try to find more information on those two, William Rogers and Donald Humphrey, but I didn't find a lot. Now, William Rogers is being charged with tampering with evidence and offenses against a human corpse. His pretrial was supposed to be held on April 28th, but it was continued to May 6th at the request of the defense for continuing discovery. And I couldn't find anything about Donald Humphrey. She mentions his name during the sentencing hearing, but I couldn't find anything. So I've got nothing. No update for that guy. But that is the case right there of Dy'mond Vaden, and yeah, it's a crazy one. But we're not going to end on that. I would like to take a moment to remember the victim in this case, George Cox Jr., who was taken from this world way too soon. He wasn't just a victim in a case. He was a father, a son, a brother, a nephew, and a friend. He was a man who made people laugh, a man who loved deeply, and a man whose daughter will now grow up without him. The greatest joy of his life was his daughter, Gianna Cox, born on July 10th, 2018. In his obituary, it said that he often said, "She's the best part of me." His love for his daughter was deep, genuine, and unwavering. He deserved more time, and he deserved better. And he deserves to be remembered for who he was, not just how his life ended. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of True Crime Wife by Jess. If you want more information about this case, check out my Facebook page, The True Crime Wife by Jess, where you can also follow me for podcast updates and additional content. Again, if you have a case that you want to see covered, please email me at truecrimewifebyjess@gmail.com. And as always, remember that every crime has a breaking point, and every woman has a line she never thought she'd cross. Until she does. I'll see you in the next episode.